I love to use dip pens for drawing, but one thing I hate is that it's really hard to draw a circle with a pointed nib. It's always hard to draw a circle or an ellipse or whatever, but it's really hard with a pointed nib. It catches on the paper because it's so pointy. This usually happens when I try to push it away from me on the upstroke, and my ellipse ends up looking like a C instead of an O. In this video, I'll show you how I made a fine pointed nib that doesn't catch the paper as much by grinding and polishing it with sandpaper. If you use a rounded nib instead of a pointed nib, then it may not catch on the paper at all. For example, you could use a Speedball B-6 nib, but rounded nibs also seem to be broader nibs, and if you want a finer line, then a rounded nib may not give you what you want. You could try to use it upside down to get a finer line, but then you may get thicker lines in one direction and thinner lines in another, because it's more like a chisel tip and less like a bullet tip. So I was wondering if I could make a smooth, pointed nib that wouldn't catch on the paper as much, and yet would still make fine lines of the same thickness in every direction. There are people called nibmeisters who specialize in grinding and polishing fountain pen nibs to make them smoother or change their shape. I'm not a nibmeister, and this is not a fountain pen, but I wanted to see if I could make a better dip pen by grinding and polishing it myself. When I say grinding, I mean changing the shape of the nib, which you can do with coarse-grained sandpaper or a whetstone or a diamond plate. And when I say polishing, I mean smoothing the nib without changing its shape very much, which you can do with fine-grained sandpaper and leather. I thought I'd try to grind and polish a Speedball B-6 nib. I really like this nib because it has a great reservoir that holds a lot of ink, but it's also very broad, even though it's the smallest nib in the Speedball B series, which runs from B0 to B6, where B0 is the largest and B6 is the smallest. I wanted something finer than the B6, and I got the idea for grinding this particular nib from the DC Comics Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics. So this is a Speedball B6 as it comes from the factory. It's a rounded nib, not a pointed nib. I hope you can see that the tip is bent upwards and rounded off. And this is a Speedball B6 that I ground to a fine point and then polished. I hope you can see that the tip is now pointed. It works really well, and I want to show you how I made it. Actually, I want to show you how I made two slightly different variants from a Speedball B6. A pointed nib, like the one I just showed you, let's call it a B6 Plus or B7 or something, and a rounded nib, almost exactly like the B6 nib from the factory, but slightly modified so that you can use it upside down more smoothly, and yet you get thin lines that are closer to the same width, whether those lines are horizontal or vertical. Again, I'm not a nibmeister, so this is my rough and ready method. I used wet and dry silicon carbide sandpaper, and I started with 800 grit, but another time I started with 2000 grit, and it also worked just fine, so I don't know how much it matters. These nibs are soft, and it doesn't take long to grind off a lot, even with finer sandpaper, so be careful. For the pointed nib, I started by grinding it upside down to get rid of that bit that's bent upwards. For the rounded nib, I wanted to keep that bit, but I ground it at a shallow angle to make it narrower and smoother, less like a chisel tip and more like a bullet tip. As I was working, I kept testing these nibs on paper so that I would know when to stop grinding and start polishing. When it was time to start polishing, I moved on to 5000 grit sandpaper, and then I finished with a leather strop. I started with a lower angle to grind the point, and then I moved towards a higher angle to polish it. But you'll need to figure out angles that work for you, and you may go from polishing back to grinding if something hasn't quite worked out right, and then go back to polishing again. And here are the results. I have two new nibs that work really well, though it may be hard to tell from my unsteady hand. The rounded nib can still be used right side up to make broad lines, but it's now a bit smoother upside down and close to the same width when used vertically or horizontally. And this quote-unquote B7 nib is no longer rounded but pointed, and yet smooth. It makes very fine lines. Here it is compared to a Sakura Micron 005 fineliner, which is supposed to make a 0.2 millimeter line. It's a bit narrower than that, depending on how much pressure you use. It's not very flexible, but it does still have some flex, so you can also get wider lines. And both of these nibs have these ink reservoirs, which means you don't have to dip them very often, but you may want to try a thinner ink that flows well if you want to use them upside down. I like Liquitex Carbon Black acrylic ink. These nibs solve a lot of the problems I have with dip pens. With ink reservoirs and fine, smooth points, they're almost as easy to use as fineliners or other disposable pens, and yet you can use them with acrylic ink, and use them together with your more flexible dip pens, pens when you need them. Of course, they still need cleaning, and they still need a bit more care than a fineliner, but I think they're worth it. Before you put away your sandpaper, there's one more thing you may want to do. These Speedball nib holders are a bit too long for my pen case, but you can cut them down to size. I used a Japanese pull saw with fine teeth, and then I sanded the end with the same sandpaper as I used for the nibs. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos about pen and ink, and please also let me know in the comments if you've tried to grind and polish your own dip pens. Thanks for watching.